What is the problem with Hungary? Hungary has both become a serious thorn in the side of Ukraine, denying the Ukraine aid, NATO ascension, etc., while also becoming a major hub in the global networks of conservative politics. In this episode of Ukraine Without Hype, we are going to dig into some of the history behind Hungary's current situation, what its ideology is, and how that ideology affects Ukraine. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. If you would like to support our other endeavors, you can go to The New Voice of Ukraine, english.nv.ua, or support it on Patreon at patreon.com/New Voice of Ukraine. So Hungary is a pretty fascinating country in that, much like Lithuania, it's a country that once upon a time was extremely large, extremely powerful, extremely politically influential, but as the centuries have gone on, has shrunk and became more peripheral to larger powers in both Europe and the world. And like in my other history episodes, there's always the problem I have of knowing when to start, so I'll just kind of speed through the early history here, just so it scratches my own brain before moving on. So the Hungarian people, the Magyars, originally came into Europe from Siberia. They are a speaker of Uralic languages related closer to Finnish and Estonian than any others, which also makes it a fairly difficult language for many Europeans to learn because it is so distant to any of them. And when the Magyars first arrived in Europe, it was kind of at the same time as the Vikings. And as the Vikings were raiding Europe by sea, the Magyars were raiding Europe by land, going as far afield as Spain, but eventually Christianizing, uniting under a single kingdom, and becoming one of the preeminent powers of Central Europe, to the point where the various Ottoman wars in the Balkans were to a great extent a contest to see who could first control the smaller principalities like Wallachia, and then a contest between the Ottomans and Austria over who would control Hungary, which shifted Hungary into purely being a part of the Habsburg Austrian Empire. That is until 48, when Europe as a whole was being consumed by liberal revolutions, and though the Hungarian Revolution of that year was basically crushed with the help of Russia, referring to earlier episodes of Russia being the gendarme of reaction in Europe, this is part of what they were doing. But the success of that Hungarian Revolution led to Austria becoming Austria-Hungary, with the Habsburgs being separately rulers of Austria and Hungary being given its own parliament and internal autonomy, but still being subject to the Austrian Habsburgs. And from 1848 until World War I, the Hungarians had a blossoming of their culture, levels of industrialization, and forming its national consciousness around this idea of this large Kingdom of Hungary. But with World War I coming around, they found themselves on the losing side, which meant that as the First World War came to an end, they were faced with the Treaty of Trianon, which tore the Kingdom of Hungary apart, giving pieces of it to Slovakia, or Czechoslovakia at that time, I should say, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Austria. And this is extremely important to understanding Hungarian politics today. They never really got over that. The entirety of Hungarian political history since then has been finding ways to reconcile itself with the post-Trianon realities. In the Second World War, the fascist government of Hungary under Admiral Miklos Horthy allied himself with the Nazis in hopes that Hitler would give the former Hungarian lands back to them. Though, of course, the reason why these lands were taken apart was because the Kingdom of Hungary was very multi-ethnic, and the parts of Hungary that were detached were the parts of it that had Hungarian minorities rather than majorities, leaving what we now see as Hungary being the part that was mostly Hungarian, as opposed to Romanian, Slovak, Ukrainian, Croatian, Serbian, and so according to the logic of the time, obviously they would be separate independent countries according to the concepts of national self-determination. Of course, with World War II, Hungary lost, and the gains it was able to make thanks to its alliance with the Nazis were reversed, and in the end ending up with a communist government under the control of the Soviet Union. That is until 1956, when we saw the 1956 Hungarian Revolution in order to establish its own path. Now, a little bit of backstory to that was that in 1953, just 3 years sooner, Stalin died. And with the death of Stalin, it led to a lot of questions within the communist space of what amount of reform, liberalization was allowed to happen. Khrushchev had begun a process of some reform in the Soviet Union, and the various satellite states started to go through their own similar process as a way of shedding the pure Stalinism of the years prior to that, though in Hungary, it would only be about a decade of that Stalinism. Less than a decade. A lot of this had to do with Poland. There were strikes in Poland asking for some loosening of the Stalinist system there, and though they were suppressed and put down, the government, with the blessing of Moscow, gave into some of their demands. And this emboldened Hungary. And one leader of the communist government in Hungary, Imre Nagy, saw this as an opportunity to promote what he called the New Course between 1954 and 1955. Nagy was not some outsider. He was not secret fascist. He was a part of the Russian Revolution. He was a dyed-in-the-wool communist with impeccable resume for that, and there's even some probably not at all true rumors that he was among the people who executed the Romanov family. Some of the post-hoc justifications for what I'm about to tell you had to do with calling this revolution fascist, when no, it was coming from within the communist system. Now, he wasn't the only person pushing this, and he was not the only person within the government. He was a minister. But as protests within Hungary, emboldened by the protest within Poland, gained strength and took over more of Budapest, the Nagy government began to follow through with the demands of the protests. There were 16 of them, not going to go into real detail, but it led to an opening up of the Hungarian system, at least for about a week or so. The Soviet invasion happened on November 3rd. Within a day, they had surrounded and begun to enter Budapest, and within short order, the Red Army crushed the revolution. But in the time it took them to do that, there was a massive, massive exodus of Hungarians into the West, leading to, really, if you meet Hungarians in the United States or other Western countries, often, if they're not a recent immigrant, they often, if their parents came from somewhere, it was probably during this time period, was a major, major exodus of Hungarians, many of them politically active, and began advocating for Hungarian interests from the other side of the Iron Curtain. Fast forwarding a bit from there to 1989, and this is, 30 years later, and the communist system in Eastern Europe is starting to fall apart. In rather rapid succession throughout that course of the year following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, more and more of these Soviet satellite states gave into demands from protesters, from revolutionaries, became multi-party democracies. This happened in October of '89 in Hungary, with Soviet troops finally leaving in 1991, beginning the era of the modern state of Hungary. So I guess that's our little history lesson. But going from history to political science, I guess, comes our next character, George Soros. You've definitely heard of him. We've talked about him on the show. You've probably seen him in an anti-Semitic screed by some weirdo Nazi talking about how the Jews are trying to replace the white race. Few people in this world have more conspiracy theories about them than George Soros. But let's get to the root. Who is George Soros? Or George Soros, but I'm not going to try and pronounce it the Hungarian way because I'm going to get it wrong, and I'll just trip over making that sh sound. So George Soros was born in 1930 in Hungary as György Schwarz. His parents were a sort of internationalist types that were common in Central Europe at the time. They were Jewish, but very assimilated, very secular, and had only minimal contact with Jewish culture. They were also Esperantists, Esperanto being a language developed at that time as a kind of utopian socialist project that said that if everyone in the world was just able to communicate with each other in a language that was neutral and not reliant on any political entity, then that could eventually lead to world peace. Though, like many utopian projects of that time, it did not come into fruition. And Esperantists were, like many other similar movements in that time period, suppressed by fascist governments, including Nazi Germany. So Horthy's Hungary, very far right, very anti-Semitic, but his parents changed their name to Soros to kind of blend in more. It was Hungarian name, while also being a play on words in Esperanto. It had meanings in both Esperanto and Hungarian. But then comes the Second World War. George is just a teenager at this point, and he's being taken in by a government official whose wife was Jewish and put in a lot of effort to save Jews. This being one of the more common conspiracies you'll hear about George Soros is that his connection to this government official made teenage George also a Nazi, when again, this government official was saving Jews at the time, including George, but also many others. And a statement that George Soros would make later in his life about that being one of the better moments in his life was referring to how he was able to see his family's bravery, not that he liked the Holocaust. That's the obvious answer. It's the answer he gave, but people are stupid and make conspiracy theories. But afterwards, George is able to leave Hungary, eventually going to the UK and later the United States, and becoming a very successful investment banker. One of the most successful investment bankers in the world, especially dealing with currencies. He is known as the man who broke the Bank of England, which is a bit of a harsh thing to say. He was able to short sell the pound at one point in time, basically because the Bank of England was being very irresponsible with its fiscal policies. Soros saw the weakness there, did a short sell, and made a lot of money. If you have seen the movie The Big Short, you may think that the characters in The Big Short about the 2008 financial crisis were doing something immoral. And as a good leftist, I do think this kind of thing does have a significant amount of immorality to it, but it's really just a thing that investment bankers do. If you're going to get mad at him over it, you kind of have to get mad at everyone. And I personally am okay with getting mad at the entire financial industry, but the people often making these conspiracy theories are pretty focused on who to be mad at, and it's the Jew. So he made all this money, becoming one of the wealthiest men, though not quite to the level of, the Walmart guys or something like that, but still pretty rich, and decided to do something with that. He wanted to spread his own brand of liberal politics. And that's where our little bit of political science nerdery will come into play. Because during his time in the United Kingdom, he studied under Karl Popper. If you're not familiar with the name Karl Popper, he is one of the most important philosophers of liberalism after World War II. And maybe his most famous and important work is called The Open Society and Its Enemies. Now, when people talk about this book, they talk a lot about the general political science theory to it that has been implemented in reality, which is that the open society is a society, quoting this definition here, an open society is one in which an individual is confronted with personal decisions as opposed to a magical or tribal or collectivist society. It is a society in which the values of equality, humanism, free speech, democracy are considered paramount. The rights of the individual and the rights of the individual to communicate with other individuals to form political bonds are what make an open society that is not prevented by the government or other potentially hostile outside forces. It is one where direct relations between individual people are considered paramount. Now, that's kind of the elevator pitch of it, but if you actually try to read The Open Society and Its Enemies, it's actually a pretty dense philosophical text that is a refutation of Hegel and historical materialism, in tracing this dispute all the way back to the Greeks, where he considers Plato to kind of be the traitor of Socrates. It's a lot. It's a lot to go into. I'm trying to not nerd out too much on that right now, but this idea of historicism you can keep in mind as basically being the Hegelian idea that there is a process within history driven by broad forces that interact with each other. Karl Popper saw as dehumanizing, that it took away the prospect of individual liberty and agency, and that this focus on grand historical narrative is what allowed for the horrific totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, both fascism and communism. So, under Leninism, where the individual is sublimated beneath the historical movements of class politics, or with fascism, where the individual is subsumed by the greater interests of the race, the folk, and individual agency can only be expressed in a kind of predatory racial permanent warfare. He saw both of these phenomenon as being essentially about this concept of historicism and this dense. That was an explosion. Gonna give this a pause. Yes, I'm recording under drone attack, but I wanted to record. I'm not gonna put it off. Returning to our story, I may do so again. Let's see how much I edit out. But that may be why some of this may seem disconnected, if that happens. Apologies in advance. So, Karl Popper considered this concept of materialism to be the ultimate enemy, and throughout this very dense and long political text, The Open Society and Its Enemies is all essentially an argument against that idea of historicism, debunking it, in the opinions of many, including myself, kind of misunderstanding Hegel along the way. And also contained within this work is his concept of the paradox of tolerance. So I'll just quote it again for what the paradox of tolerance is, because it can get a bit muddled and it's best to give the direct words for it. So, quote, unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed. Intolerance with them. In this formulation, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies, as long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion. Suppression would certainly be most unwise, but we should claim the right to suppress them, if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal. In the same way, we should consider incitement to murder, or to kidnapping, or to the revival of the slave trade as criminal. So what he's saying is that a society cannot have unlimited tolerance, or it will only invite intolerance. If there is a Nazi death squad beating down your doors, you can't debate them. You have to shoot them in the face. They have no interest in argument. They see argument as merely a way of exerting force. They have to be shut out in whatever means is proportional and appropriate for that time. So within this concept of the paradox of intolerance and the opposition to historical materialism, we see part of the foundations of what would become post-World War II liberalism. It was now a liberalism that was much more on guard from political extremism. It is a liberalism that survived the Second World War, that saw the rise of Stalin, and had to find a way of figuring out how to have a liberal society while keeping those two forces far away from it. I remember watching some newsreels from the 1950s basically explaining Hitler too far to the right, Stalin too far to the left. What we have here right in the middle is the sweet spot of liberalism. And that was the identity of post-war liberalism, largely thanks to Karl Popper, but also other philosophers, of course, contributed to post-World War II liberalism. The time period between the 1940s through 1970s, I'd push it as far, was very dominated by liberal ideologies, and therefore, obviously, there were a lot of people involved. John Rawls and his work, A Theory of Justice from 1971, another major part of 20th century, second half of 20th century liberalism. We're not doing a lecture about liberalism right now, but keep in mind that this is the ideology that George Soros was trained in as a young academic and brought with him into his professional life and what he wanted to spread once he had the money to spread it. Which is why later on in life, when he came time to name his organizations, he called it the Open Society Foundations, after directly the name of this book. And he is very open about this. He's given lectures about Karl Popper and his philosophy and the theory of change that he wants to take with him into his philanthropy. It's a very important part of what made the support for civil society what it was in the getting into the 90s and 2000s. But George Soros started this pretty early. He began supporting anti-Soviet dissidents as early as 1979. He funded the emigre work of a lot of Soviet dissidents who had escaped to the West, as well as others from Soviet satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe. And as we get into the 90s, as a lot of these countries begin to open up their political systems, they begun to put less restrictions on the press, less restrictions on foreigners coming in. This was the era of glasnost in the Soviet Union, which was mirrored in a lot of Soviet satellite states, though not all of them. Different Soviet satellite states did have different policies. Some of them remained more hardline in the 80s than the Soviet Union. Some became more light-handed than the Soviet Union in this time period. But as early as 1984, George Soros was able to open up his foundations in Budapest. He was allowed to. These were still small, still suppressed. People who would take part in the activities of his foundations would, of course, be followed by a secret police at all times. It was not an open society, as it were, yet, but he was trying to make it one. And he was promoting different dissidents and dissident groups within Hungary, again, starting in the mid-80s, several years before communism fell there. And when it came time for communism to fall, many of the people involved in the opposition movement that made that happen had been funded, had been trained, had been supported by George Soros. And in the 90s, while all these former communist countries are coming apart, one of the people most involved into easing their way into the Western world, into liberalism, into neoliberalism. Some of the ideas here are good, some are bad, though within this group of people who were making this transition, Soros was more on the kind of pro-welfare state, pro-social democrats kind of end of the spectrum, and often opposed the more hardline shock therapy type economics that many of his contemporaries were pushing onto these countries, often with negative results. But one of the main things that George Soros was doing in this time was, well, he was throwing money at a lot of civil society programs, not just political ones, but also cultural and other civil rights type activities, though some politicians, of course. And one of the most important things that he supported in Hungary was the Central European University. Central European University was a much more Western modeled university that existed in Budapest for many years until it was gotten rid of for reasons we'll explain later. And it became this training ground for all kinds of activists, civil society, political, cultural, whatever it may be, that went on to become quite influential throughout the post-Soviet space within Eastern Europe. A lot of the leaders of LGBT rights organizations, of election monitoring organizations, of anti-corruption groups, they either attended Central European University or they went through training programs, gave lectures, connected in one way or another with CEU. There was a time when I was still having an idea in my head of possibly going back to school for my PhD to do it through Central European University, though I've given up on that idea. For much more detail on how civil society works, I recommend going back to our episode where we talked about Georgia and the anti-civil society laws that Georgia has now passed, where we talked about the importance of this civil society training. I'm not going to go through another hour of that, but just as a shortened thesis version of that, by supporting civil society, it was able to create a class of political activists that were not directly controlled by some kind of existing political or oligarchic or other structures that were directly answerable to potentially hostile political forces. That civil society allowed these leaders to come up through the ranks without those connections and become politically influential based on these ideas of openness rather than being the son of a red factory owner or something. But anyway, very important stuff. But going back to our story of Hungary, specifically, one of these young leaders who went through these training programs, who got funded to go to school, who made his connections through the George Soros network, was a young man named Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban got a scholarship to go to Oxford in 1988, paid for by George Soros, and his political career within Hungary in the 80s as a dissident was largely supported by Soros-funded media projects. He did not stay at Oxford because Hungary was about to have a revolution, and he could not miss that for anything. So Viktor Orban came back to Hungary as it was all coming apart to head up the Fidesz party. At the time, well, it's liberal conservative is how you can think about it. It was believed in opening up society to multi-party democracy, to all the things that we would understand as being a part of a Western political system, while still being conservative-minded. This was a kind of stance that was pretty popular in Central Eastern Europe at the time. A lot of the opposition to the communist governments came from religious people, from people who would be understood as being on the conservative side of things in Britain or the United States, but still had their main political commitments being to the creation of liberal democracy. And at the time, that's what Viktor Orban was. That changed later. So throughout the 90s, Orban was very politically active in this liberal conservative Fidesz political party, until eventually becoming the prime minister in 1998 until 2002. During this first period of time, I don't run across too much of poo-pooing him. He was still a reformist, still could be broadly considered liberal as opposed to the Socialist Party, which is still strong in Hungary. And it was during his first premiership that Hungary was able to join NATO. So he was certainly not a Europe skeptic at the time. But then he lost that election in 2002 and spent his kind of exile years as the leader of the opposition, shifting more towards the conservative side of liberal conservative, until eventually giving up on liberal entirely. So this government, from 2002 to 2010, went through 3 different prime ministers. The most important of them was Ferenc Gyurcsány of the Hungarian Socialist Party from 2004 to 2009. And it was during his premiership that they joined the European Union in 2004. So another major step towards Hungary being part of the broader European system. It now had access to open travel, open markets, access to funding through the European Union systems, etc. So that's a major goal achieved for any Hungarian government. But the rest of his time in office was much more fraught, riddled with corruption, and maybe the biggest individual movement was the Osgood speech in 2006. This was a speech that he made to the Hungarian Socialist Party. It was supposed to be behind closed doors, and because he thought no one was listening, got a bit too candid. We keep this podcast family friendly, so I can't actually quote this speech, because it is absolutely riddled with profanities, and pretty strong ones at that, including the way he referred to Hungary in particular. But he included the phrase, "You cannot name any significant government measures that we can be proud of except pulling our administration out of the blank at the end. Nothing. Has healthcare system improved?" I reply, that's a load of blank. They just recognize your name. He admitted to lying to the people about their goals, about what they were able to achieve, and this was leaked to the public, leading to large protests, and really never regained the trust of the Hungarian people, even though he did remain in office again till 2009. This was 2006 where this happened. So a very ineffectual government that would, of course, eventually being replaced. He stepped down in 2009. He was succeeded by Gordon Bajnai, but that was really just a kind of caretaker government before further elections could happen. And further elections, when they did happen in 2010, in came Orban again for the second time, and that is where he has been ever since. He has been prime minister since 2010. I don't think any system should allow that outside of extreme circumstances. And the first thing he did was make sure he could never lose again. Because of the peculiarities of the Hungarian election system, even though they did not gain a huge win as far as number of votes go, the number of mandates they won were very, very large. Large enough to make a new constitution. A new constitution that made it even harder for him to lose in the future. So that is the first step that he takes, is make it so he can never lose again. And though I think he will, that is what has kept him in power since 2010. This extreme weighing down on the electoral balance has led to much stronger election results than actual numbers would suggest. Americans may be familiar with this. And in his new premiership, he was, again, much more conservative than he had been in the past, put a lot more emphasis on the family, of Hungarian nationalism, of consolidating power around himself, as well as building up those relations with Russia, which will become relevant later. Including in 2014, he built the PAX-2 nuclear power plant along with Russian investors. This same power plant that just had Russian sanctions lifted against it. Also in 2014, he announced the creation of what he called illiberal democracy, as opposed to liberal democracy, but that'll be our next segment. With this idea of declaring that Hungary would no longer be a liberal democracy, that Hungary would follow this path of much more reactionary type policies. Orban became very loud about his intentions here. Really, it was self-promotion even. Though again, these early changes often had the interesting side effect of putting more and more power in his hands. Part of the election laws, for example, and giving Hungarians outside of Hungary. Remember when we talked about the Treaty of Trianon, the Kingdom of Hungary being dismantled, about how Hungary tried to join with the Nazis to take it back? That was still very, very relevant in the 2010s, still relevant today, but Orban extended Hungarian citizenship and the right to vote to these Hungarian ethnic communities in Romania, Slovakia, Ukraine, Serbia, allowing him to vote. And predictably, these people, when it came time to vote, had much more nationalistic ideas in mind when they came to do it. Meanwhile, a Hungarian who was born in Hungary, but left Hungary in order to go to school, for work, because he was gay and didn't like the environment in Hungary anymore. That sector of the voting public, that one that might be more prone to vote against Orban, they did not receive the same ease in voting as these heritage voters, we can call them. They had to appear at an embassy at election day to cast their vote in person at that point, whereas these heritage voters were allowed to simply mail in a ballot, further putting Orban's finger on that electoral scale. Following the Syrian civil war in 2011, very early on in his premiership, there was more of a refugee crisis, one that became much larger with the creation of ISIS in 2014 and the rampage it went on, as well as the fall of Aleppo in 2016, leading to much larger outflow of refugees. Many of them went to Europe. It was a major political topic at that time of these massive numbers of Syrians, but also Afghans and others who were coming into Europe, freaking a lot of people out and leading to a lot of nasty racism that led to the surge in support for right-wing parties throughout the continent and certainly contributed to things such as Brexit. But Orban seized on this more than anyone. Hungary became the shield of the West against the onslaught of Muslim invaders. It became the loudest voice in not allowing any refugees to enter the European Union, including building a border fence with Serbia, Serbia not being in the EU, making Hungary-Serbia border the entry point for them, and truly made being anti-migrant the cornerstone of his entire political identity. It was almost the only thing he would talk about a lot of the time. Well, complainers out there, I actually just want to defend Hungary and Europe as a whole from the Muslim invasion. It became the ultimate deflecting point. It was the only thing that he would talk about, to the point when the European Union began to put some level of sanction on the Hungarian government for its abuses of democracy. The Hungarians just straight up lied about why those reprimands were happening. They were often specifically about the quality of democracy, about how under Orban's government, if Hungary was to apply to join the EU in 2018, they would not be allowed to join because the quality of their democracy, because the quality of their state of rule of law, because of the hyper monopolization of the media by the centralization around the person of Viktor Orban, it was no longer qualified to join the European Union. But they already had joined, so it didn't matter. But Orban's messaging, when these complaints were made, was that Brussels is just punishing us for not accepting migrants. No, that's not why. That's just what you want everyone to believe is why, because it is the jangly set of keys that a shocking number of people not only fell for at the time, but continue to fall for America. So, as his relationship with other EU governments became more strained, he became even more hardened in this idea of illiberal democracy and eventually left the European People's Party in 2021. The European People's Party is, if you're in the EU, operating in the EU Parliament, your national level party will often join an alliance of similar ideology parties within the European Union system. Liberals align with liberals, social democrats align with social democrats, Christian Democrats align with Christian Democrats. The European People's Party was the Christian Democrat party overlay. Now, for a very long time, Orban had already abandoned normal European Christian democracy long before that, but in 2021, he made the formal break, instead formed the Patriots of Europe, which I'll get into more when we describe the actual system in place here. But basically, he left the association with the center-right towards the far right. Now, during all this time, I said that he was often in conflict with the European Union. However, the EU has a lot of veto points, points that require unanimity, and among them is that in order to pass a serious sanction against any one member of the European Union, you need a full consensus. And for a lot of this time, it was backed up by Poland with the PIS party in Poland, who was doing many of the same things, of holding late night sessions where they made important changes to the budget without actually telling anyone else, of supporting far right nationalism, of doing all these other nasty things that Orban did. And so kind of right-wing government of Poland and the right-wing government of Hungary covered for each other. So whenever they began to get in trouble with the rest of the European Union, they had a veto over any sanctions that would happen one against the other. As long as there's one other EU country supporting you, there's not much the EU can do about it. With the replacement of the PIS party in Poland, Hungary lost that protection for a moment, but they have now been taken up by Slovakia. Slovakia, who has tightly aligned its ideology with Viktor Orban. Okay, so that's all of our history for now. Viktor Orban, in the wake of a embarrassingly ineffectual government headed up by an alliance of socialists and liberals in the thousands, is able to come back full swing in 2010, and a lot of reading you'll see about him is that this was a more gradual process, but it really wasn't. He really hit the ground running very, very early in his return to the premiership. He's pretty much always been who he has been, even in his days as a liberal. As I've read more about him, maybe when you do it, kind of do it with hindsight and knowing where it ends up, the things you can point out in his personality and in his stances, you can make post hoc predictions about where that's going when you already know the outcome. Maybe, but to me, I don't buy this story of him going from being a good liberal to an illiberal as a natural ideological process. He has always been a political opportunist. It was just that in the late 80s and early 90s, being the liberal was the one that got you more support. And since 2010, and especially since 2014, he saw that being this right-wing hero was what got him more support, and adjusted accordingly. But what is this idea of illiberal democracy? This is a word that Orban himself used. Now, he did not coin the word. It has been around for a while. It was used to describe this idea of there would be a state that had the form of a democracy. It would have voting, it would have free elections, but the people would vote for illiberal, even authoritarian leaders. Now, the very clear model before this was Russia. Russia did have elections. Russia still has elections. These elections are often fraudulent, but if they weren't fraudulent, Putin would still probably win. Though, of course, the obvious counterpoint to this idea of illiberal democracy is that it's not a very good democracy, and how much can you abuse a democracy until it's not democratic anymore? If you're illiberal, if you're authoritarian, if you're this centralizing strongman leader who does not believe essentially in the rule of law, then you're going to rig elections. There's not going to at least be fair elections, certainly. It is entirely possible to have an election where people vote, where people's votes are counted correctly, but because of the other rules in the system, the election is not fair. That there's not fair access to information for all political actors. That some are simply able to crush any rivals through just spending. There's, of course, always a bit of this in any system. Outsiders will always be disadvantaged. So this is a sliding scale. But where on that sliding scale where you say this is no longer democracy? And as I'll get into at the end, I think Hungary is still enough of a democracy for Orban to lose, but any opposition has to cut through some serious institutional bias against them. But we'll get into this more. So illiberal democracy, according to Orban, began with this speech. And again, I'll go back to quoting the speech. So this is now the words of Viktor Orban. Quote, "What is happening in Hungary today can accordingly be interpreted as stating that the prevailing political leadership has today attempted to ensure that people's personal work and interests, which must be acknowledged, are closely linked to the life of the community and the nation, and this relationship is preserved and reinforced. In other words, the Hungarian nation is not simply a group of individuals, but a community that must be organized, reinforced, and in fact constructed. And so in this sense, the new state that we are constructing in Hungary is an illiberal state, a non-liberal state. It does not reject the fundamental principles of liberalism, such as freedom, and I could list a few more, but does not make this ideology the central element of state organization, but includes a different, special, national approach. So in practice, what are the elements of Hungarian illiberal democracy? I think there are 6 major features of what makes illiberal democracy, at least as it exists in Hungary. The first of these is Hungarian nationalism. Now again, this has to be very, very stressed. Hungary is smaller than what they imagine it to be. The Hungarian nation extends outside of the Hungarian state, at least as they interpret it to be. Any part of the Hungarian political spectrum sees some level of responsibility to Hungarians that live outside of Hungary, either because of emigration or because Hungary was just cut away from them. This greater Hungary idea is going to exist wherever. But Orban took it to a much larger extreme, sometimes explicitly racist one. In 2018, he gave a speech where he said, quote, "We must state that we do not want to be diverse, and we do not want to be mixed. We do not want our own color, traditions, and national culture to be mixed with those of others. We do not want this. We do not want that at all. We do not want to be a diverse country." And though there's not necessarily a state policy of racism, the political sphere in Hungary under Orban rule has been very fertile ground for anti-Semitism, racism against Romani, obviously against migrants, like his whole thing is being anti-migrant. It has frequently been at odds with neighboring countries over issues of national identity. He has frequently been in one kind of diplomatic argument or another with Romania. Slovakia has had to pass its own laws in order to keep Hungarian national policy at arm's length. Ukraine, of course, we'll get into that at the very end. Many of his conflicts have been around this idea of Hungarian nationalism and Hungarian irredentism, and seen himself not only as the leader of Hungary, the country, but Hungarians, wherever they are as a people, to the exclusion of and often hostility with non-Magyars, non-ethnic Hungarians. A part of that is preserving Hungarian culture. Now read that the way that many other far-right politicians would. This doesn't necessarily mean, promotion of traditional Hungarian arts per se, though also that. It means defining certain things that you don't like as being anti-Hungarian. Being gay is anti-Hungarian, though historically Hungarians have been pretty important in the development of queer liberation. But besides that, the other element of this is Euroscepticism. Now, like I said, during his first term in office, Hungary joined NATO. Hungary joining the EU has been an incredible boon for the Hungarian economy. The way the Hungarian economy works is kind of the relationship that Mexico has with the United States, in that a lot of German firms have factories in Hungary where labor laws are a little bit more abusive and the pay is lower, but it's not very far away from Germany. A German manager is able to visit his factory in Hungary in, a long weekend, just a couple hours away from Berlin. And these companies are Audi, BMW, and this is very deliberate on the part of Hungary. This is their economic plan. It's not as though Hungary joined the EU and they're immediately crushed under the force of German capitalism. That's kind of why they wanted into the EU. They wanted those jobs. They wanted the economic development that came with having those factories. They wanted the tax revenues from those factories existing in Hungary. Orban is certainly not against those industries. And in fact, some protests a few years ago were against a bill that would have reduced labor rights in a way that benefited these German firms. Made a lot of people very mad. Access to European markets is vital for the Hungarian economy, and they have received a lot of subsidies from Brussels. So there's a lot of Hungarian roads out there, a lot of Hungarian small businesses out there that exist because of EU funding or from the economic benefits that exist from being part of the EU. Nobody in Hungary wants to leave the EU. But as a part of this illiberalism, Orban began being hostile towards the EU almost immediately. I already explained in the section about Orban up there about this relationship and how he avoided it. Not going to repeat that, but he has been always at odds with Brussels, always at odds with Germany. And a lot of it is just because he can make as much noise as he wants, he can use as much rhetoric as he wants. He's still getting those Brussels bucks. Those subsidies aren't going away. That access to the common market's not going away. So his ability to be a Eurosceptic, to trash the EU at any given opportunity, is done from the safety of knowing he gets all the benefits of being an EU member while still positioning himself as an enemy of Brussels. Though that is starting to change, where he is trying to build a larger coalition within the European Union of far-right parties to change the character of the EU to being more far-right, to being more supportive of ultranationalism. Next section. The next tenet is the most important one, which is being anti-migrant. Now, I explained the most important part of this. During the Civil War, increase in refugees, the political situation in Europe as a whole became much more anti-migrant and still is. So this idea of being anti-migrant became very popular in Hungary, and so Orban used it to bury everything else. Just only talk about being anti-migrant, deflect every other criticism of you by just saying, look at them coming at me for protecting my country from migrants. The next cornerstone here is being anti-LGBT. So this is a part of the nationalism, this is a part of traditional values and all that. And in 2021, they passed a law very similar to the Russian law that banned references to gay people and trans in ways that kids can access them. Can't have a book that says that a character is a boyfriend. Whatever you do, don't watch Modern Family if you have someone under the age of 18 in the house, or you're technically breaking the law. And then in 2025, covered this recently, Hungary banned the Pride Parade in June last month. It was banned. And that led to Hungarians turning pride not just into a symbol of a pro-LGBT, pro-queer politics, but also a way of protesting against the government. You want to ban this? Screw you, we're going even harder. And became one of the largest protests in Hungarian history this couple weeks ago. Though during all of this, as always, when you see homophobic politician, you're going to find a guy who gets arrested at a gay orgy. One Hungarian politician, part of the Fidesz party, who had been a serious enemy of the gay community in Hungary, was arrested at a gay or trying to escape from a gay orgy. So there's that. The next element here, again, a part of traditional values, pronatalism. Have more babies, have larger families, This included tax breaks for women who have more children, a lot of other state support if you have a larger family. This was a way of saying we need to make sure there's more Hungarians. There is a racist element to this, of course, because while the government is promoting larger families for ethnic Hungarians, at the same time, there's a serious scandal about how in the Roma community, they're just treated miserably by the medical system, leading to much higher fatalities in pregnancy. So, more babies for Hungarians. Let's let the Romani babies die. So, pronatalism is never pronatalism across the board. It's usually eugenics. And in this case, it was eugenics, though mostly failed eugenics because the Hungarian birth rates have not really gone up, even after all these incentives. So, those are the main ideas here: nationalism, Euroscepticism, being anti migrant and anti LGBT, while promoting larger families. But underneath this, I think is more structurally important to illiberal democracy. The thing that makes it illiberal has been the erosion of democratic norms and the attacks on the opposition. Now, one of these is that he turned George Soros into public enemy number one in Hungary. Every single problem that happened in Hungary was the fault of George Soros, and therefore, in order to take down this globalist conspiracy being orchestrated by the Jewish billionaire, and yes, they leaned into that, it gets real anti-Semitic, had to take down this conspiracy by the Jews to undermine Hungarian society by trying to outlaw George Soros. There was this anti-Soros bill that they passed that was intended to dismantle this system of civil society funding that existed in Hungary that allowed for there to be any outside political influence besides Orban himself. And really, these efforts have been very successful. Central European University is no longer in Budapest. It's now in Vienna. The exact law that they used to take this down was by banning gender studies, and they had a gender studies program. That has always been, like, I don't know, conservatives really hate the existence of gender studies. If you think that's not an economically viable major, fine. If someone chooses that, they make that choice. I certainly didn't choose a very economically productive major either. Who am I to judge? But they turned gender into this horror word. Gender is coming for the Hungarians. Gender ideology is wearing down. You have to have a Hungary without gender. And so they closed down the central hub for liberal political organizing, not only in Hungary, but Central Eastern Europe as a whole. Although the interesting thing here is that gender, as it's described, often has to do with language. I identify as he, him, that kind of thing. Hungarian language doesn't have that. It's not a gendered language. So most of these debates make zero sense when spoken in Hungarian. Everyone is it. So yeah, just eliminating, essentially, this civil society opposition. But also, and one that Americans listen to this right now, it is something that we have gone through, and as a journalist is very important to me personally. Orban made a very, very concerted effort to monopolize and take control over the media in Hungary. A lot of this had to do with withholding government advertising within local newspapers, which sank their ability to make revenues, and because of that had to sell out. And who was there to buy them out? The Kesma company. This company was owned by close allies of Viktor Orban and worked within his political interests. And they bought nearly every local and regional paper in Hungary, nearly every local and regional television station. They own almost the entirety of Hungarian media in order to do propaganda for Viktor Orban. And I see this in America right now, where local media has withered away in recent years. This hasn't been intentional. It has been a part of the economics of how the news works. A lot of independent media has shut down within recent years. And though it wasn't a conspiracy in the US as it was in the case in Hungary, the end result becomes that there's only these mega conglomerates who are able to kind of deal with the very, very narrow margins of the media industry. And so all these local newspapers, local TV stations, your Fox 4 News, is a lot of that owned by one company who is able to monopolize that information. And local media is often the most important media because they're the ones to find those stories as they are happening, to report on local corruption, and without them, the rot is able to set in at the ground level and spread upwards. And that's exactly what's happening in America, and that's what happened in Hungary. Anyway, patreon.com/Ukraine without hype and patreon.com/NVUA. So yes. And so in Hungary now, most news you'll see is news that Orban wants you to see. There's some exceptions. The Nepzava newspaper is still operating as an oppositionist kind of newspaper. There are still some media that is in opposition to Orban, is pro-European, pro-liberal, whatever the case may be. A lot of this operates in Budapest. There is an extreme, very extreme discrepancy in Hungary between the kind of political forces that are in Budapest, which, like any metropolitan city, will be more liberal than the countryside, and the rest of Hungary. Once you leave Budapest, though, it's essentially a series of fiefdoms by Orban's friends who own everything, almost. Add this on top of the changes to the electoral laws I already talked about, and the quality of the democracy is in stark decline. Now, I'm describing all this, and it seems quite negative. But to others, they see a paradise. And so Viktor Orban, who has largely taken control of Hungary and is able to begin to put his ideological program into place, now looks to the rest of the world and sees what influence he can wield. Now, the most direct way that is happening is, like when I was talking about the biography of Orban, his political party switched sides. They have left the Christian Democrats, are now part of what's called the Movement for a Europe of Nations and Freedom. It is an alliance of political parties within Europe that have similar ideologies, similar far-right nationalist ideologies. Most of these political parties also have close links with Russia, especially the Freedom Party in Austria, but I'll just list them off. If you are familiar with European politics, you'll immediately know what these people stand for. But I can't dig into all of them. Just understand far-right, nationalist, Eurosceptic, pro-Russia political parties. So these are the League of Salvini in Italy, the National Rally in France, the ANO, Babish's party in Czechia, Enough in Portugal, the Freedom Party of Austria, whose foreign minister is currently in Russia after taking up a role and as a board member on multiple Russian fossil fuel companies. The Party of Freedom in the Netherlands as a part of Geert Wilders, another far-right celebrity in Europe, the Vox Party in Spain, Flemish Interest in Belgium, the Conservative People's Party of Estonia, Latvia First, the National Movement in Poland, the Danish People's Party, Voice of Reason in Greece. And in observer status, the Likud Party of Israel, the political party of Netanyahu, because interestingly enough, even as Orban uses anti-Semitic, not even dog whistles, just normal whistles in order to drive out democratic forces in Hungary, being very anti-Semitic and allowing for more anti-Semitism within Hungarian political system, he is also able to cashier himself by getting the approval of Bibi Netanyahu. I don't like that very much. Though notably, this alliance does not include the Alternative for Germany party. They have their own thing. PIS in Poland, the Law and Justice Party, though previously a vital ally to Viktor Orban, they have come into more conflict regarding Russia because Law and Justice, despite, problems which we've discussed in the past with Ukraine, are still ultimately not friendly to Russia, whereas Orban is, and Law and Justice has positioned themselves as not as far-right as Orban, despite their many similarities, and so caucuses with a more mainstream right kind of caucus. But anyway, so it's not every right-wing party in Europe, but a lot of the really bad ones. And through that, he's making especially important alliances with Slovakia, like I mentioned. Robert Fico is kind of a discount version of Orban and is working with him very closely within the European Union. Orban tried to push a much more similar party to himself in Romania, though, as we described in very recent episodes, that did not work. And is very intent on building this network of like-minded people within the European Union, because they don't want to leave the EU, they want to get the benefits of the EU, but they want to reforge the EU in their own image. But what a lot of you want to hear about is America, because Hungary has really become the sweetheart of the United States. Now, some background here. It has often been the case that the conservative movement in the United States will pick one country or another that they will see as something they want to emulate, something they see as representing one or another version of their ideal in government. Back during the apartheid years, a lot of important people in the conservative movement in the United States forged close relationships with South Africa as well as Rhodesia. As we've described in past episodes, there's a lot of conservatives who see Russia as the ideal political system. Israel, of course, very close ties, but for one way or another, those don't work as well as Hungary. And you really have to ask yourself, why? Like, why Hungary? Why did Hungary become such a model for the international and especially American far right? They are not a large country, not an economically powerful country. Their economy is very reliant on their larger and wealthier neighbors, mainly Germany. They're not militarily powerful. They don't have a massive amount of cultural soft power that way France or the United Kingdom or frankly even Russia have. But I think by eliminating why some of these other model countries don't work, we can see why Hungary is perfect. So South Africa and Rhodesia, those are of course the darling of conservatives in the 80s and 70s. But they were pariahs, especially Rhodesia, more so even than South Africa. Aligning yourself with them was fine if you're going to treat yourself as some kind of dissident or brave intellectual striking out into the unknown. But in the 80s, most people kind of hated South Africa and Rhodesia, even in the West. They were examples of what society can't be. You would get advertisements for Rhodesia in like Soldier of Fortune magazine, not on NBC. Israel hasn't worked, I should say. Despite the close relationship between Netanyahu and Trump, between the Likud party and the Republican party, that they speak at each other's events, that they are as close as two political movements can be, Israel really hasn't imported American conservatism. Americans have tried. They very much have tried to kind of create Israeli actual Republicans. And the only people who vote for them are a handful of American immigrants. There's what's called, I think, the Jerusalem Institute, something like that, that pushes this kind of American, specifically American conservative view into Israeli politics. They just don't take hold. Israel, despite going through neoliberal reforms since the 1970s, kind of in its bones still has some of that socialism in it still, to where even though it seems from the outside that American and Israeli right wing goes together like peanut butter and jelly, on an ideological level, they kind of haven't. Russia, similar problem with South Africa. Russia is an ideal society to a lot of conservatives because it also is an evil expansionist empire who hates gays and minorities. And it's strong. That's the most important thing there. They see Russia as a country that is able to impose its will on the world through shows of raw strength, which Hungary cannot do. But even in our current climate, where the Republican Party and Donald Trump have quite obviously been working in Russian interests, either directly or indirectly, it's hard to say outright that you're pro-Russia in the year 2025. You could 6 years ago. You definitely could in 2012, 2013, but it does still have that stink on it. So instead of saying I'm pro-Russia, they say I'm neutral and don't support American money going to Ukraine without saying directly I support Russia, even though that's the end result and why they're saying it. And interestingly enough, they also tried to do this with China. If you looked back to the kind of pre-Trump era, you'll run into a lot of conservatives who are talking about that the Chinese model of Confucian paternalistic management. But once China became the enemy, that kind of got downgraded to nothing. I still remember, though. Well, Hungary, not only despite being smaller and weaker and less important, makes it better for these purposes. It's not controversial. It's not out there invading its neighbors. It's not out there doing genocide. It's, racist, but they like that. And it doesn't have the kind of the bad PR that a Russia would have or a China would have or many other countries that might qualify but have worst public image in the United States. You can go to Hungary just fine. I recommend it. I enjoy Hungary. Budapest is a fun city. It's very pretty. There's lots of stuff to do. There's a lot of cool people. Go to Budapest. The worst thing about being in Budapest is how accessible it is because there's no Ryanair flights coming in from the UK full of the most annoying British people in the world getting violently drunk and puking everywhere with their 12 friends. Going off on a sesh with the lads. That's Australian, whatever. It's late and I'm being bombed. So I'm not on my A game with accents. It's part of the EU. You can go there on like a weekend trip and it's not hard or expensive to do. There's nothing suspicious about going to Hungary. Get some of that goulash. It's great. Paprika, man who enjoys paprika, thank you very much, Hungary. So you can have these press junkets, political meetings in Hungary, and no one thinks that's bad. So it's because under any normal circumstance, it wouldn't be. The reason it's bad is the people doing it, not the fact that it's in Hungary. But anyway, that's why, I think, mainly. And also, Budapest it's not as grand as Vienna, but it still has that old Austro-Hungarian feel to it. It's pretty, the architecture's cool, it has that kind of old world aristocratic aesthetic to it in a lot of places, and they love that. They eat it up. This group of post-liberals in the US see themselves as essentially European Catholic dissidents. And so, those Americans who view themselves in a bit more European Catholic dissident vein really love their Hungary. So if you read the Claremont Review, if you read stuff from the Heritage Foundation, anything from the intellectual right for the past decade, it is just the most, they just write love letters to Viktor Orban all the time. Now, that also has changed. Before, it was Hungary and Poland. If you zoom back to about 2015 or so, you had a lot of white nationalist far-right figures going to Poland and Hungary saying, look at this beautiful white country full of beautiful women and where women know how to be women and men know how to be men and there's no minorities around and no Muslims or anything like that. And the Jews know their place. Please no one take clips from this. We're going to these big far-right rallies and saying, this is the white nationalist future I want. Again, that ended with Poland as the Polish government changed and how all these weirdo white nationalists took the side of Russia, which meant that Poland was no longer on the team. But they kept going with Hungary. They certainly kept going with Hungary. But within this intellectual side of the right, the post-liberals, the Catholic integralists, that kind of thing, they were all always going back and forth with Budapest. The main conduit is something we talked about in our J.D. Vance episode because it's all very tied into the political background in J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance was a Catholic convert who became a Catholic integralist, and that is the faction that spends the most time in Budapest, this group of people who want like a Catholic theocracy. And the point man for this was a man named Rod Dreher. Rod Dreher was a longtime conservative commentator who worked for the National Review, all the things he wrote for it. Conservative in good standing. And maybe his most famous book is something called The Benedict Option, referring to Saint Benedict, the kind of founder of the monastic tradition within Catholicism of going out into a cave and devoting yourself wholly to God apart from society. And that kind of was Rod Dreher's model for what to do as a political project in the modern world. So again, to quote from The Benedict Option, quote, "Today, a new post-Christian barbarism reigns. Many believers are blind to it, and their churches are too weak to resist. Politics offers little help in this spiritual crisis. What is needed is the Benedict Option, a strategy that draws on the authority of Scripture and the wisdom of the ancient church. The goal, to embrace exile from the mainstream culture and construct a resilient counterculture." Not end quote. Not necessarily going off to a cave or something, but creating our own conservative, Christian, political, cultural worlds that we can fall back on, and from there be able to leave our imprint on mainstream culture from our bulwark within our own far-right Christian counterculture, the Benedict Option. And that's kind of what they turned Hungary into, isn't it? Everything that I said about illiberal democracy became a test case for what American conservatives wanted to do in America. It became this monastery to affect the wider culture from this redoubt of the far right, this Piedmont. This term Piedmont refers to the Piedmont region of Italy, where Italian nationalism was able to first gain a foothold and expand out from there. And in modern political terminology, it's this smaller region where this national idea is able to take hold and from there spread to the wider area you want to affect. So it's this Piedmont of an international conservatism. And through that, they would invite all these conservative figures in the United States, would receive state-sponsored trips to Hungary. A lot of that through something called the Damn You Institute, which was founded in 2012, has frequently worked with the Heritage Foundation, and again, is funded by the Hungarian government. Tucker Carlson, like all these people on the American right have received these state-sponsored trips to Hungary to connect them with this conservative Piedmont on the Danube River. This group of people was especially important in the kind of Ron DeSantis camp of people. Ron DeSantis was very, very close with the various conservative intellectuals who based themselves out of Hungary. Though, of course, it was all crossed over with MAGA, but Florida became the place where this illiberal democracy took hold in the US. It was where they tried out all these weird ideas that were eventually picked up by Trump and the MAGA movement, etc., and spread throughout. But a lot of those intellectuals sided with DeSantis before they quickly realized that wasn't going to work and all just fell back into line with MAGA again. And so in Florida, you may remember the Don't Say Gay bill, which said that you can't mention the existence of gay people in schools or in school libraries or anything that kids can get their hands on. And that bill was directly influenced by Hungary's law that was identical, almost identical. And it happened only 1 year later. So it's not merely a matter of, who's having coffee together in a cafe in Budapest and talking about the virtues of the pre-Enlightenment. It had direct policy implications. And no, Hungary did not invent conservatism. Hungary did not invent the right wing, but it was something that conservatives and the right wing were envious of and looked to for inspiration, just as Orban looked to the US for influence. This was a mutually beneficial relationship. And kind of the apex of this became when CPAC came to Hungary. CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference. It started in 1974. It was the central event of the conservative movement in the United States. Often there will be a kind of straw poll at the CPAC before the elections of who they like in the Republican primary, and that kind of becomes seen as the choice of the activist class within the Republican Party. It is very easy to go to as a young activist in the US, is how careers are made in Republican Party in America. Go to CPAC. You will meet people, you will find internships, connections, etc. that move you up into the movement that liberals don't do, unfortunately. And there have been international CPACs before, there's one in Japan, but they're all very small affairs that weren't very important. But when CPAC came to Hungary in 2022, it became, the second billing. Because all these people were in Hungary anyway, here's an excuse to go to Hungary again and see their buddies at the Danube Institute. See very high-level support, etc. Connecting Hungarian conservatism to American conservatism even more tightly. And this has happened even ever since, though in 2024, they began this policy of not allowing any hostile or not explicitly pro-Orban media to go. Though now there's also a CPAC in Poland, which started for the first time this year. So there's all these institutional connections, all these ideological connections. They're working together on a singular, common project across countries, throughout the European Union, in the United States. And when it comes to relations with other countries, Hungary sees other governments with what it sees as its ideological ideal of having a strongman in charge of a country that is ultimately centralized around him. They see that as something to emulate, something to support, and when there's more countries like them, they will be more secure. And so they have often promoted the politics of the interests of Azerbaijan in the European Union with Aliyev. They have promoted the new Georgian illegitimate government, I will say, when the European Union tried to put some sanctions on Georgia for its various abuses, and there have been updates on that. They'll be for next episode. Hungary has stepped in to try and protect them from EU sanction because they like those repressions. Russia, the relationship with Russia is not only economic, it's not just about the power plants and the oil. They like the Russian system, and the stronger the Russian system is, the stronger they are. Ukraine, which they see as a liberal project, a Europeanist project, a kind of Euro-Atlantic project of liberalism and openness and civil society and all that good stuff, they want that to lose for their own purposes, for their own ideology. And to cap this all off, before I talk about Ukraine in more detail here, this is a global movement united behind common interests and ideologies who work together in very direct networks of political influence, education, and political development of individual actors, of individual politicians. It is now the official policy of the United States State Department to promote those dissident right-wing politics in Europe, which is why they have put their American influence behind supporting the Alternative for Germany party and all these other right-wing parties within the European Union, in Romania, in France, in the UK, and everywhere, because they see it as a singular project. And they have a tremendous amount of discipline in trying to execute it. And they have a tremendous amount of organization in getting the right people in place to promote each other. This is something that liberals and the left do not do. There are countries, there are movements that liberals and the left see as cool in one way or another. A lot of anarchists see Rojava in Syria as a major exponent of their ideology, and so support it not just to support Kurds, but to support their ideal of a left-wing society. Liberals, they might like Canada, I don't know, but it's not the same level of organization and support. Interestingly enough, the nationalists, the conservatives, the localists who want to keep foreigners out and their own traditions and individual ideologies and identities as strong as possible that are under threat by the foreign hordes, they are far more internationalist than the left are, who claim to be internationalist. Every liberal and leftist in the world should be looking at Ukraine and saying we need to support them against a reactionary imperial genocide. But that has not happened. And the efforts to organize a kind of politics that would support that are virtually non-existent. But just to say how this has affected Ukraine directly, as you've explained in the past, the largest interaction between the Hungarian and Ukrainian governments since 2014 has been about language. It's been about national policy, like as in national minorities policy, where Ukraine did in fact pass some laws that were very imperfect regarding the spread of the Ukrainian language, especially in schools. The initial version of these laws would have made it near impossible to have publicly funded Hungarian schooling. That obviously was met with severe blowback from not only Hungarians, but also Romanians and other ethnic minorities within Ukraine. Also for myself, I opposed that law, though eventually that law was able to work itself out to be much more accommodating for the demands of the national minorities. It's more of a tiered system, easing their way in, though I would say that the implementation of it is still very imperfect on the part of Ukraine. There needs to be more effort to actually instruct people on Ukrainian before demanding they get instruction in Ukrainian. But that said, this issue that could have been very easily resolved, or not easily, but could have been resolved through a diplomatic process involving experts and community leaders, instead became a wedge that Hungary has used to undermine Ukraine at every opportunity. Hungary has persistently blocked meetings between NATO and the EU with Ukraine, saying that those meetings could not happen until their demands were met regarding language policy. Now, usually Hungary has backed away from this. Usually they get basically bribed. They're offered something they want more than the ability to mess with Ukraine and get it. Hey, it's politics. But especially as this war has gone on, they have seen their ability to mess with Ukraine from a stronger position than they ever have. They are on the border with Ukraine. They have Ukrainian refugees. They have the ability to say no to the EU giving assistance to Ukraine when that assistance is no longer a matter of economic development, but physical survival. and they've held it over Kiev's head this entire time. As we've learned recently, in a recent episode, I've explained this, the Ukrainian intelligence services released information that they knew that Hungarian intelligence was working within the Hungarian populated part of Ukraine in order to gauge their interest in national reunification, aka invading Ukraine on their own. Now, obviously, they didn't do that, so this fact-finding mission probably didn't go very well, though there's a lot of anxieties in Ukraine in general, and especially in the Zakarpattia region where this happened, of Hungarian aggression of one kind or another. And as I stated in the last segment, not only is this a matter of Hungarian regional hegemony over what they see as the borders of a greater Hungary, the same thing they bother Romania with. It's not only a matter of basically causing as much problems and then being paid to stop causing those problems, but it's also that they have received their payments to stop causing problems. But as I said, also this ideological goal of wanting Ukraine to fail because of what it represents, and wanting Russia to succeed because of what it represents. But to round this all off, I have to say that it's certainly not the wishes of Hungary as a whole. As time has gone on, there has been more and more resistance against the Orban government. Economically, they have been a failure. Hungary is now one of the poorest countries in Europe. They have fallen behind many others, including Romania, the country that they usually see themselves as being superior to. The pronatalism obviously didn't work. The migrant issue in Europe has significantly declined since the heyday of the heights of the Syrian civil war. And now that the Syrian civil war is over, though I suspect there's still going to be continuous fighting for a while. Civil wars like that don't end cleanly. It will not only lead to the repatriation of some refugees back to Syria, but also not as many push factors out of Syria anymore. So the issue of at least Syrian refugees in Europe will not be as salient as it was. So all the yelling they had that Orban can make a show of doing about the threat of migrants. Yes, it is easy to distract people. It is easy to get people in this anti-migrant hysteria that really doesn't actually affect them. America, pay attention, in a way that is used to distract from them hurting your actual material conditions. Racism doesn't pay rent. Well, it does if you're a Twitch streamer. After all these years, the failings of Orban as a national leader are becoming more obvious, which is why the polling for the next election, that will be in 2026, at present show Orban losing. And in his place is Peter Magyar of the Tisza party, which is still pretty conservative, but conservative in a pro-European way, in a pro-Ukraine way, in a way where Magyar's going to the people, actually physically going to these Hungarian communities outside of Hungary and asking them what their actual interests are, instead of just feeding them, national mythology. And in a clean election, it seems like Magyar will win. In a clean election. But this is a liberal democracy. The biases are in place. The institutions are in place to prevent an honest, democratic change in government, which is why illiberal democracy doesn't actually exist. So that is what I leave you. The story of Hungary. A lot of research into this one. I hope you enjoy it, and it let me do my ideological digs, which I also enjoy just as my own personal interests. I enjoy talking about the right-wing weirdos and how they interact with each other. In the future, I intend to mix more of these audio essays in more, so go to our Patreon and our Discord and tell me what you want to know. Also, through New Voice of Ukraine, I'll be doing questions and answers on various topics, so head over there for even more information, though I am cross-posting those now. So you're getting all of me on the Ukraine Without Hype Patreon, trying to keep those as unified as possible so everyone can see what I'm doing. Join us over there, patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype, and thank you all very much to our supporters. So thank you to Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Arminius, David Shepard, Giorgio Vanakakratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike, PLM, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Elizabeth Hughes, James Burke, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, Nick Niazin, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Abel Lenz, Ian McDowell, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Can Dystopian Fiction Please Remain Fiction, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Dan, David Wall, Demetrio, Dana Jones, Dish Taco, Emily Bivona, Etienne Soleil, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Joseph, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin Devendorf, Justin R., Kiwi Valley, Kyle Johnson, Laura DeLeon, Laurie Halila, Lemoninkin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, That's Okay, Noah Brown, Noam RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Tokayuk, Stuart Akers, Settle Knife, Ursula, Solenkov, Veronica Aim, Victor Matei, William Brown, Yellow Duck, Zay Perry, and Marcus Nashkus. Thank you all very much for your support. You're what make this all possible. And until next time, Slava Ukraini, and God bless the future of a democratic Hungary.